When we hear the word terrorism, most of us probably first think of the deadliest, most violent attacks.
The 9/11 terrorist attacks immediately come to mind as the most obvious and impactful example that resulted in a complete transformation of the U.S. response to terrorism and the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. So needless to say, it exists in a class unto itself. Before 9/11, the 1995 bombing of a federal building in Oklahoma City is the attack that would have been on the top of most people's minds. However, these large-scale, high-profile, deadly attacks are out of the ordinary. They do not exemplify the typical terrorist incident.
While it may seem as if terrorism is on the rise considering how much the threat is discussed, research on terrorist incidents shows us there have generally been fewer attacks over time. However, the number of mass casualty incidents has gone up. In this respect, the trends we see in terrorism incidents mirrors those of violent crime in the U.S. Violent crime has been trending downward since the early 1990s, but mass casualty shooting incidents have increased. Of course, we're talking about long-term general trends here. But one thing is undeniable. The U.S., like many other places around the world, has long been a terrorist target and a center for terrorist activity. And the nature of the terrorist threat changes drastically over time. Left-wing anarchists, black nationalists, and revolutionary socialists in the 1970s, environmental and animal rights extremists in the 1990s and 2000s, and radical Islamic jihadists in the 2000s and 2010s. Going back even further, there's a long history of racially motivated terrorism by white supremacists, from the days of slavery followed by the Ku Klux Klan all the way up to the modern rise of the sovereign citizen and white nationalist movements. And while terrorism often seems random, unprovoked, even unexplainable, we'll spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out what we can. The who, what, when, where, why, and how of terrorism. To begin this endeavor, it is essential to accurately define the nature of the terrorist threat. How terrorism is defined shapes public debates about how much of a threat is posed by terrorism, whether terrorism is increasing or decreasing, and who engages in terrorism. Who actually is a terrorist.
Defining the terrorist threat shapes how elected and criminal justice officials respond to terrorism incidents and shapes efforts to prevent terrorism from occurring.
Billions of dollars each year are spent on anti-terrorism measures. If the terrorist threat is not accurately defined, these resources will not be used effectively or efficiently. To this point, some may be surprised to learn that domestic terrorism, acts perpetrated by U.S. citizens, increased dramatically since 9/11.
It occurs far more frequently and results in more casualties than international terrorism, acts that are carried out by foreign actors, non-U.S. citizens. Despite this, international terrorism continues to receive far greater attention, coverage, and resources and is
commonly considered to be the greater threat. Failing to accurately define the terrorist threat
can result in those who don't pose a threat being unfairly targeted, while those who do pose a threat go undetected. Despite this importance, there is no commonly and universally agreed upon definition of terrorism.
There are at least 100 different definitions.
Governments, policymakers, law enforcement, academics all have different definitions. Different agencies within the federal government even define terrorism differently. 3 examples are noted here of definitions from the FBI and the Departments of State and Defense. This illustrates the difficulty of coming up with a definition everyone can agree on. Everyone seemingly has slightly different interpretations of what constitutes terrorism based on what fits their own purposes and responsibilities.
So then, why is defining terrorism so difficult? Well, it's important to keep in mind that terrorism is a social construct. Different individuals and groups in society help to shape our shared conceptions of what terrorism is. Our ideas about the terrorist threat vary widely,
depending on our own perspectives, backgrounds, and experiences. This illustrates how difficult defining terrorism really is. The meaning of the term can be highly subjective.
To illustrate, there's a famous phrase you may have heard at some point. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. This points to a number of important questions.
Under what circumstances is a person a terrorist as opposed to a freedom fighter? And who makes that determination? And when is that determination made? Consider that the very same people who were considered freedom fighters by the United States when they were fighting against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s later comprised the terrorist group known as Al-Qaeda. The inherently subjective nature of terrorism results in a lack of agreement and a wide array of definitions, which in turn contributes to confusion surrounding how to define the term. So it's a vicious cycle, and one that won't be resolved anytime soon. It is important to consider who has an interest in defining incidents as terrorism, to think through the intentions behind the claims of terrorism, what they have to gain or lose from a certain outcome, and any underlying biases that may shape how they view terrorism. For instance, law enforcement may or may not want to label a crime as terrorism because they don't want to say that terrorism occurred on their watch, or they may want to access additional resources that may be available for anti-terrorism efforts. Prosecutors may not want to label a crime as terrorism because they want to charge the offenders with crimes like homicide or fraud rather than terrorism. Political motives may be harder to prove in court. On the flip side, prosecutors may want to pursue terrorism charges to increase the potential penalties and put pressure on the defendant, or to send a general message to those who may be considering committing similar acts.
Then there are the inherent political implications of using the terms terrorism or terrorist. It is a strong, value-laden construct that judges the motives and morality of groups and individuals it is affixed to. For this reason, politicians may be either eager or hesitant to define certain acts as terrorism because doing so may either upset or please certain constituencies. They may also use the label of terrorism to rally their supporters around a particular course of action or policy. Defining some acts as terrorism can be politically advantageous for those using the label and tremendously damaging for those engaging in the acts being labeled. It has also been used rather loosely by some who want to target their political opponents, particularly in the context of those in power labeling those who oppose them politically as terrorists. For example, in the Syrian civil war over the last decade, Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has defined those who are fighting against his government as terrorists, while many others, including political leaders in the U.S., consider them to be freedom fighters.
If we were to define terrorism as any violent act that opposes the official policies or actions of the state, then al-Assad would be correct in his definition. However, you'll find a great deal of dispute with this assessment. Many would consider the acts of violence perpetrated by al-Assad's government against the Syrian people to be state-sponsored terrorism, where the state actively engages in or encourages terrorism as a means of repression to maintain power and control.
So, it's a complicated picture, and again speaks to the subjective nature of terrorism as a social construct. For our purposes when examining terrorism, we'll be focusing primarily on non-state actors. State-sponsored terrorism and other acts of state-sanctioned violence, genocide, and war, including military responses to terrorism, are whole separate matters worthy of their own concentrated attention. That said, I will be discussing in detail the fallout from 9/11, the War on Terror, and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq in something that I've never done before, a special live stream on the 20th anniversary of 9/11 on my YouTube channel. So stay tuned for more information on how you can join in. This leads us to an important distinction between two related terms:
terrorism and extremism. Although the terms are often used interchangeably, I'm guilty of this myself,
it is important to clarify the differences between them. One way to think about it is to distinguish behavior from belief.
Extremism speaks to a mindset, a belief, a value system, an ideology,
based in something that is far outside conventional, mainstream, social, political, or religious beliefs.
White supremacist, anti-government, Islamic jihadist, anarchist, environmental animal rights extremists.
All of these are examples of extremist ideologies. Now, take the conventional political spectrum, for example, from right to left. Most people will fall somewhere between mainstream left and mainstream right. A much smaller number will be out toward the far ends of the spectrum. Even then, most individuals who hold beliefs that could qualify them as extreme far left or extreme far right still do not engage in any activity that would be considered terrorist. Many simply hold an extreme social, political, or religious ideology but never act on it. Or they engage in legal behaviors with like-minded individuals, such as joining a hate group. Terrorism, on the other hand, involves illegal behaviors, such as acts of violence or other crimes. An even smaller number of extremists will eventually become terrorists when they engage in violence or commit crime to further their extreme ideology.
In this sense, we can say that while all terrorists are extremists, not all extremists are terrorists.
And an important note here as well, to be careful not to equate extremism with activism. Lawful gatherings
to protest unjustified shootings or economic injustice or government infringement upon the rights of citizens
This is not extremism, and certainly not terrorism. Here's one way to illustrate this point. If Black Lives Matter supporters are all considered terrorists, as some have called them, simply by gathering together to lawfully and peacefully protest, then, logically, every red hat wearing MAGA supporter should be considered a terrorist for doing the same thing. As, in many ways, BLM and MAGA can be viewed as two sides of the same coin. But I think most would agree these designations on both sides would be a stretch of any meaningful usage of the terms. BLM supporters are not inherently extremist anarchists, and MAGA supporters are not inherently extremist white supremacists. Now, certainly, there are those within these movements who could rightfully be described as extremists, but this is a much smaller number than the whole. And activism can certainly morph into extremism and cross the line into terrorism with the development of increasingly radical belief and behavior, but this occurs more rarely and is not a foregone conclusion by any means. This discussion around when the terms extremism and terrorism are used raises an important question. What is it about an illegal act that makes it necessary to call it something other than a crime? Some would argue that terrorism is more severe than crime, that terrorism is violent, while most crimes do not involve violence but instead involve property, like theft or fraud. However, terrorism does not necessarily have to involve casualties from violence. Acts can be labeled as terrorism even if they did not successfully harm any intended targets. And while terrorism has traditionally been thought to consist only of violent acts directed by formally organized groups, it has become more widely accepted in recent years that terrorism can be committed by individuals acting on their own apart from any terrorist group connection, which has become known as lone wolf terrorism. So our understanding of terrorism has evolved. Furthermore, there are important terrorism-related issues that don't involve direct acts of violence, such as terrorism financing. So then what is the distinction between terrorism and crime? Well, while definitions of terrorism may vary based on the seriousness of the act, who or what is targeted, whether groups or individuals committed the act, and numerous other factors, most definitions of terrorism require that terrorism is perpetrated by one or more offenders who have a social, political, or religious objective, an extremist ideology. It's an additional layer on top of the criminal act itself, indicating an extremist motivation that is driving the behavior. This is what separates terrorism from other types of crime. So why does all this matter? What are the consequences, the practical and policy implications for classifying a crime as terrorism? For offenders, defining their crimes as terrorism makes a difference in how their criminal case is handled. There are penalty enhancements for terrorism that go beyond what an offender who committed a similar act not classified as terrorism would have received if convicted. It also affects how offenders in particular groups are viewed by the public and by possible terrorist sympathizers. For communities where terrorism occurs, defining an incident as terrorism could lead to stigma and labeling of the community. Consider the scrutiny many Muslim communities received after 9/11. For the media, labeling crimes as terrorism makes them more interesting, giving them more front-page coverage and airtime on TV news, which increases sales and ratings. For intelligence and law enforcement communities, if crimes are labeled as terrorism, particularly international terrorism, the FBI typically would take jurisdiction of the crime, and it becomes important for state and local law enforcement to communicate and provide support to federal officials. So in short, classifying a crime as terrorism matters a great deal. To conclude this discussion of defining terrorism, it will be helpful for our purposes to have a working definition of terrorism to refer to. This working definition of terrorism will include violent, fatal and non-violent crimes. Crimes against political and government actors, social groups, and random citizens perpetrated by non-state actors. Crimes that are wholly or in part motivated by ideology, and crimes committed by individuals, small cells, or members of formal organizations. This definition allows us to look at many different aspects of terrorism and avoids artificially restricting ourselves to a narrow view of terrorism or being too broad and unfocused.